All right, back in our component, here where we create a form control object. Look at this constructor. So far, you have seen these two parameters. The first one is the initial value, and the second one is one or more validator functions. Now let's take a look at the third parameter. Here we have async validator. And as you can see, the type of this parameter is either async validator function or an array of async validator functions. Let's go back to Angular website and look at the declaration of this interface. So here we search for async validator function. And here's the declaration of this interface. Now look at the signature of this function. Just like before, this validator function takes a parameter of type abstract control, but the return type is a little bit different. Previously, the return type used to be validation errors object or null, but now it's promise of validation errors or null, or observable of validation errors or null. So basically, this function should either return a promise or an observable. What are these classes? Well, in JavaScript, we use promises and observables to work with asynchronous operations. Now, how they are different is beyond the scope of this section. Don't worry about it now. We're going to look at observables later when we talk about connecting to the server. So let's simplify this. Don't worry about this second part here. We want our validator function to return a promise of validation errors or null. These angle brackets you see here determine the type of the result of an asynchronous operation. In other words, when that asynchronous operation completes, in this case, when the call to the server completes or the timer function completes, the result that we're going to get is either a validation errors object or null. As another example, if we had promise of number, the result of an asynchronous operation would be a number. So when that asynchronous operation completes, we either get a number or in case of a failure, we'll get an error. So now let's go back and modify our validator function to return a promise. So here's our validator function, should be unique. The parameter is exactly like before. I'm going to change the return type from validation errors or null to promise of validation errors or null. Okay. Now here we need to return a promise object. So return new promise. Now look at the constructor of the promise class. The first time I saw this, I totally freaked out. It's too complicated, but actually it's very easy. Let me simplify it for you. The reason this looks complicated is because of this arrow function syntax. So here we have 3 arrow functions, and I'm going to simplify them one by one. Look at the first one here. This arrow function represents a function with this parameter, which is either a value, which is optional, or another promise. Okay, so this function takes this parameter and returns void. Okay, and this is actually the type of the resolve parameter here. So let's simplify this. I want to get rid of this arrow function syntax. Just remember that resolve is a function that takes a value and returns void. Okay, now look at the second arrow function. This function takes a parameter called reason, which is optional, and the type of this parameter is any. And as you can see, this function returns void. And once again, this function is the type of the reject parameter here. So I want to simplify this. Remember, reject is a function that takes an optional parameter called reason and returns void. So now we have another arrow function, an arrow function that takes 2 parameters, resolve and reject. And as you saw earlier, both these parameters are functions. Okay, so this function takes these 2 parameters and returns void. And this function is the type of executor, which is the parameter of the constructor of the promise class. So back here in the constructor of the promise class, we need to supply a function with 2 parameters, resolve and reject. So a function with 2 parameters, resolve and reject. And you know that both these parameters are functions. So this goes to a code block. This is a void function, right? Now we use this resolve parameter to return a value to the consumer of this promise. So whoever is interested in this promise, when our asynchronous operation completes, we want to give them some value. we use this resolve function to return a value. So instead of returning, let's say true, we want to call resolve true. Okay? And in case of a failure, we're going to use the reject parameter. So we can call reject, and here we can optionally specify the reason for the failure. Here we can have a simple error message or a complex object with details about why this operation failed. Okay? So now that we have a promise object, I'm going to move this code to the body of this executor function here. So here we have an asynchronous operation. When this operation completes, we want to return a value to the consumer of this promise. So instead of returning a validation errors object here, we're going to call resolve and give it this object. And similarly, instead of returning null, we want to resolve null. But here we need to add the else keyword, because when we use the return keyword, the control exits from the function. But here, we're not exiting this function. So if username is Mosh, we resolve the validation errors object. Otherwise, we resolve null. Okay? And this was purely for demonstration before, so it's not part of our implementation. Delete. So this is how we implement an async validator. The return type of our validator function should be a promise. And here we should return a new promise object. And we can use these parameters resolve and reject to either return some value to the consumer of this promise or return an error. Now finally, we need to register this in our form control object. So we go back to our signup form component. Here's our username field or username control. In the constructor of the form control class, as the third argument, we supply our async validators. So I add username validators dot should be unique. Okay, now let's break this up into multiple lines so it's cleaner and more readable. Okay, that's better. Now to display this validation error, we should go to our template and add another div. So here's our template. I'm going to duplicate this last div here. So if usernames.errors.should be unique, then we want to change the error message to username is already taken. Let's test this. So back in the browser, I'm going to type Mosh here, but note that this validation is going to take 2 seconds because of our set timeout function. So Mosh tab 2 seconds after, and we got this message. Username is already taken.